Okay, well, what'd they tell him? They want to pull back to the Pusan perimeter, but why? Oh, well, what did Ridgway say? Oh, yeah, I saw that coming. Okay, yeah, see ya. February 25th, 1951. Mao Zedong is the leader of Communist China. He has an enormous amount of power and commands a huge amount of respect. Can you imagine just bursting into his bedroom unannounced while he's sleeping? Who would do such a thing? And what happens to them afterwards? Well, it happens this week, right here. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the Chinese fourth phase offensive tried plowing southward in central Korea. It was very much blunted, though, at the Battle of Chipyong Ni, where a small, surrounded UN force badly defeated a much larger Chinese force. That is something new for this war. I'm going to begin today with a quote about that battle, sort of to set the mood, which among Matt Ridgway's U.S. 8th Army is one of optimism, very much the opposite of what it was not that many weeks ago. General Ridgway felt that the 8th Army had reached a turning point, that it had substantially regained the confidence lost during the distressing withdrawals of December and early January. In his judgment, the defense of Chipyong Ni by an isolated combat team without grievous losses against a force far superior in strength symbolized the revitalization. Task Force Krombez, in its relief role, epitomized the offensive spirit. With renewed spirit, Ridgway considered his forces quite capable of further offensive operations, which he immediately proceeded to design. That's Chipyong Ni. But last week, I didn't have time to go over what was happening around Wonju and to the east, and I'll go back over that now. What the ROK, the South Koreans, needed to do was stabilize the east shoulder of the lines. Now, on the 13th, U.S. 10th Corps Commander Ned Almond ordered ROK 3rd and 5th Divisions to pull back to between Wonju and Pyeongchang. This proved to be beyond 5th Division's powers, and 10th Corps' eastern flank was in jeopardy. Meanwhile, ROK 3rd Corps Commander Yu Jae-hung was authorized by Ridgway to set his 3 divisions on a general line between Pyeongchang and Gangneung. The North Koreans, the KPA, then attacked towards Pyeongchang, hoping to push from there to Yonggwol. And they really struck hard the 15th. Over the next 3 days, they took it and drove down the road to within 12 kilometers of Yonggwol, but were stopped by the end of the week and driven back. Yu's lines reported no enemy contact the 18th as the week ended. Also by that time, Almond had sent American forces northeast to bridge the dangerous gap between ROK 3rd and 5th Divisions and ROK 3rd Corps. It seemed, though, that the KPA, the North Korean forces that had savaged 5th Division, were also used up in the battle, because there is no enemy contact here also the 18th. In fact, as we saw last week, the North Koreans and Chinese have withdrawn from their entire central salient by the 18th, and there isn't contact all along that part of the line where the Chinese offensive hit. Now, the 29th Independent Infantry Brigade is still trying to drive the Chinese from the steep hills some 35 kilometers southeast of Seoul. Last week ended with the Chinese still holding the topmost ridge. Well, the final assault comes the 20th when the Royal Ulster Rifles from the brigade and elements of neighboring U.S. 24th Infantry Division, supported by the guns of 24 tanks, 16 Bofors guns, and the 24 big guns of the 45th Field Regiment, climb the ridge. They find the Chinese have vacated the premises, so they get to spend what must have been an extremely uncomfortable night atop the ridge in temperatures well below zero with no bedding, no blankets, and no hot food. Okay, new operations. Actually, already while the fight for Chipyong Ni was in progress, Ridgway was planning for an attack to clear the Chinese from there and the mountains to the southeast. And the evening of the 18th, he plans attacks designed to not allow the enemy to get any respite and to destroy the forces moving north out of the salient. Sending one thrust up Route 29 from Wonju beyond Hongsong and another up Route 60 from Yonggwol to beyond Pyeongchang would, in theory, block the main route of the enemy withdrawal. Other forces would head up and clear the adjacent ground. This is Operation Killer, and it's set to go off already this week on the 21st. In a little irony, though, while Ridgway has utmost confidence in his frontline units, he certainly does not have it in members of his own staff. As this week begins, he receives staff recommendations that he asked for at the end of January for what territory 8th Army should aim to occupy over the spring and the summer. He is shocked by what he gets. His staff proposes that 8th Army stop offensive actions now, defend where they are until spring arrives, and then withdraw to the old Pusan perimeter. Giving up ground that they now held? Giving up the initiative? Ridgway tells them, as he has before, that they all need to be thinking of attack. One big problem that Ridgway has is he doesn't have all that much real knowledge of his enemy's strength, especially reserve strength. He's operating now on an estimate his intelligence staff gave him February 16th, based on what they could figure out at the front. They say the enemy has 5 PVA, Chinese, armies and 3 KPA corps manning the lines, and 3 PVA armies and 1 KPA corps just behind them in immediate reserve, right? They've identified the KPA 1st Corps and Chinese 50th and 38th armies from Seoul eastward along the Han River to Yangpyeong. They are less certain that the Chinese have the 42nd, 40th, and 66th armies between Yangpyeong and Hongsong, and even less certain about the identification and precise location of the 37th, 39th, and 43rd armies behind these guys. From Hongsong to Pyeongchang, they think the North Koreans have the 5th and 2nd Corps with the KPA 3rd Corps behind them. On the East Coast, they have the KPA 69th Brigade, which is now under 2nd Corps. They are unaware that massive casualties the past few weeks have depleted both KPA 5th and 2nd Corps, and so several divisions have been inactivated, and those troops spread among other divisions. But that is exactly the kind of knowledge Ridgway is demanding, even if he gets it in incomplete fragmentary form. A lack of or limited knowledge of enemy reserve locations and strength can play a huge part in an operation. Ridgway has also gotten intel reports that 7 new Chinese armies have entered the Korean peninsula, 4 of them assembling near Pyongyang, and 3 joining the 9th Army Group around Hungnam and Wonsan. But none of his intelligence personnel, can tell him whether any of these guys are heading south. So that's 10 Chinese armies in North Korea. So he's planning his attack, realizing that the sudden appearance of enemy reserves may quickly end it. He tells his commanders to be really careful advancing, keeping units always intact, and carefully and thoroughly coordinate movements both between and within corps. He absolutely does not want them to be sucked in and destroyed piecemeal, whether by ruse or the temptation to your own aggressiveness to pursue beyond your capability, providing powerful support, or of timely disengagement and local withdrawal. When UN Forces Commander Douglas MacArthur learns of Operation Killer, he heads over from Japan to meet with Ridgway, and Ridgway gives him the details. MacArthur's visit ends, as it always does, with a press conference, during which Mac announces he has just ordered the offensive to resume. This bugs Ridgway, and not because MacArthur had nothing to do with ordering the offensive to resume and is taking credit, but because MacArthur always comes over to Korea just before an offensive begins, and they always have that press conference. So the world knows he's been in Korea, and the enemy might put things together and know when they're going to launch future attacks based on MacArthur's visits and press conferences. The Chinese began withdrawing from their salient in central Korea at the end of last week. So they've had 3 days to do that by the time Operation Killer begins at 10 a.m. the 21st. So if they are to be destroyed, and they are, that's why it's called Killer, the UN forces will have to advance pretty quickly. But then the weather intervenes. The first 20 days of February, the weather sucked. But it was at least normal winter weather for around here, with the daytimes often hovering around freezing or even a couple degrees above, and the nighttimes going down to minus 10 or 15 Celsius. There is some snow and some ice, and it remains on the ground, not having a chance to melt. The morning of the 21st, though, it goes up to over plus 10 Celsius and barely touches freezing at night. This pattern continues for the rest of the week. And it also rains from the 21st to the end of the week. This turns streams into deep, raging rivers with big floating chunks of ice in them. Low bridges are washed out or at least damaged beyond heavy use. and you can forget about any fords. Roads just become quagmires of thick mud during the day, but then get nighttime freezes of surface ice that make them even more difficult to navigate. Countryside becomes mudflats. There are even landslides that block tunnels and railways. It's pretty bad. So Killer is not a quick advance at all when it goes off. And it isn't even really an advance by columns, but becomes a more uniform clearing operation, fighting the weather as much as the enemy. That enemy leaves rear guards, though, pretty strong ones, to fight delaying actions while he continues evacuating the salient. That is what happens the last half of the week. Ridgway monitors the advance both from the skies and through his corps commanders. And though there are supply problems, no one wants to call it off, and airdrops fix that for the most part. And by today, communications, which have been pretty sabotaged by weather, are basically working as they should. There is a major hiccup for the attackers, though. At 10:30 a.m. the 24th, the helicopter carrying 9th Corps Commander Bryant Moore crashes into the Han River. Neither Moore nor the pilot are actually hurt in the crash, but Moore dies of a heart attack about half an hour later. Now, if you'll remember, Moore just took over 9th Corps at the end of January, specifically picked by Ridgway for the job. Ridgway tells Tokyo of the death and wants Joseph Swing, who just now commands the Army War College, to succeed Moore. This request has to be considered and processed, of course, and in the meantime, Ridgway appoints O.P. Smith, 1st Marine Division Commander, to run 9th Corps. So a Marine is in charge of a major Army unit. Ridgway thinks this is an excellent chance for the two branches to come together. But the result on the ground this week of Operation Killer is just taking back some of the ground the Chinese took lately. 2 weeks ago on the 11th, MacArthur told the Joint Chiefs he's going to order 8th Army forward either until they run into the main enemy line of resistance or it becomes clear there is no such line south of the 38th parallel. The British government makes clear to the Pentagon that no military decision should be made to cross that line until there is political agreement to do so in the UN, especially by the countries that have sent units to Korea. British Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin, who is deathly ill, insists they should not make even minor incursions across the parallel. MacArthur says, should he discover the enemy is not holding ground in force below the line, he'll tell Washington and wait for instructions. However, he insists he is still operating under his original Security Council remit, and that is the entire Korean peninsula. Taking ground until they run up against the Chinese is, as I've said before, at odds with what Matt Ridgway wants. He's pretty certain taking territory is not important. It is inflicting unsustainable losses on the Chinese that is the ticket to victory, or at least will convince them that they cannot win. But it's not just MacArthur who has preconceptions that may not be what is called for in Korea. Mao Zedong does too. It was now Mao's turn to be the prisoner of his own mindset. As MacArthur had failed to factor in the effect of a political revolution in a country he had known almost nothing about, so Mao now failed to factor in the effects of the vast American technological superiority and the ability of American troops when commanded by a great general. As Mao had once said of MacArthur, arrogant, egotistical men were easy to defeat. Peng Dehuai, Mao's commanding general, has been a bit more realistic about things. He had not been keen on launching the new offensive, but did it because he had to. But maybe after the defeat, which came as a huge shock to much of Chinese command, he'll be listened to. The Chinese historian Chen Jian writes, Chipyong Ni changed everything. Up until then, the Chinese thought they were doing very well, and they thought they knew how to fight the Americans, that they had the secret. They were sure they were going to win the war and do it very quickly. They had all the momentum, starting with the victories up along the Chongchon River. But at Chipyong Ni, Peng had used his best troops, the best from all his divisions, and they had not just been defeated, they had been forced to flee by a much smaller force and had taken enormous casualties, many thousands of them at just Chipyong Ni. To Peng, something has to change. On the 20th, he goes to Beijing to see Mao. Mao is asleep when Peng arrives, and Mao's bodyguard tries to block Peng from barging into Mao's bedroom. Peng says, "You cannot stop me. My men are dying on the battlefield. I can't wait for him to wake up." So Peng bursts in and wakes up Mao to try to make him realize they have a new and different war on their hands. There would be no rush to Pusan, no great American retreat south. They now had to prepare for a long war, and they were going to rotate some of their troops because the kind of combat they were engaged in was exhausting to the men. That morning they agreed upon some rotation of troops, even though part of Mao, clearly dreaming different dreams from Peng and other commanders on the battlefield, still believed that the entire Korean peninsula might yet be his. That's a real moment, huh? Peng bursting in and waking up Mao. Well, the war has its moments of drama. Back on December 1st, if you'll remember, we had a real dramatic moment when U.S. President Harry Truman said the UN forces were not ruling out using atomic bombs in the war. That was really a watershed moment because the loud response it provoked from literally the whole world cleared the air about where everyone stood about China. The world did not want a general war, and the world did not want an atomic war. The U.S. had finally, it seems, gone too far. After the 1st of December 1950, the Allies who had tripped unquestioningly into Never Never Land would never again allow the United States an unlimited credit card, moral or otherwise. For by the 1st of December, the vast majority of the member nations of the UN wanted out of the Korean debacle. Whatever the moral issues, few saw any profit in a continued war with Red China over the eventual fate of a divided Korea. The smaller nations had been willing to follow the United States into a small conflict, a police action, against an aggressor, as long as the fighting had a clear moral purpose and demanded few sacrifices of them. Now the Earth was on the brink of general war, and the moral purpose of defeating Red China was not at all clear in European minds. 5 years after the most destructive war in history, few nations were willing to risk atomic war for any reason short of immediate self-preservation. The thing is, back last summer, the only reason the UN could vote to begin this police action was that the Soviet Union, North Korea's sponsor, was absent. Without the Soviet veto, the Security Council could do this. American strategic planners did not want to be in such a situation again, and changes were made in the general framework of the UN so that on certain issues, serious issues, the Security Council's power was negated or diluted to the point the General Assembly could bypass it. In effect, such changes meant that eventually the UN would pass, with constantly increasing membership, completely from big power control. American planners, unfortunately, could not see they were tugging at the lid of Pandora's box. So here in 1951, the U.S. kind of now has to work out policy within the fold of many conflicting policies in the UN or be branded a hypocrite. Truman called a National Security Council meeting January 12th, and they basically told MacArthur the U.S. is not doing things alone, but is pursuing collective security with the UN, and that the course MacArthur favored, blockading China, bombing the Chinese mainland, enlarging the war, I've gone over this before several times, was, well, let's just say that Truman had sent out feelers, and there was not one single government in the UN that would back such a course of action. But there is, of course, some support at home in the States. MacArthur has friends and supporters, for example, in Congress, and he is in contact with them, making addresses and sending his thoughts and opinions. And President Truman is unaware of this. I wonder what will happen if and when he becomes aware of it. Perhaps we'll find out one day soon, but not this week. For this week of the war is over, with Operation Killer slowly following the retreating Chinese and North Koreans up the center of Korea, and Peng in Beijing trying to make himself heard. Oh, and the blockade of Wonsan that began last week continues this week. South Korean Marines take the island of Sindo in Wonsan Bay. You know, the events of the past couple weeks have shown the UN forces that the myth of Chinese superiority that many of them had believed was in fact just a myth. It's not just the morale of the American forces that's improved. Remember, unlike the Chinese or some of the other UN forces, the American units have pretty much been either raw and untrained or at best garrison units with no real combat experience. Commanders have lately noted a dramatic improvement in the men's general physical condition, though, and many are really becoming battle-hardened. I will quote David Halberstam's The Coldest Winter yet again. This was one of the great mysteries of combat, the process of going from green, scared soldiers to tough, grizzled, combat-ready, but still scared veterans. Some men, a small percentage, never made it. They remained green, a burden to themselves and the men around them, in a permanent, hopeless incarnation as soldiers. They were incapable of or unwilling to break out of their civilian selves. Most men, however, whether they liked it or not, went through that transformation. They might regret it when they came home, and it might be a part of their lives they never wanted to revisit, but they did it. No one entirely understood the old process, perhaps the most primal on earth, that turned ordinary, peace-loving, law-abiding civilians into very good fighting men, or one of its great sub-mysteries, how quickly it could take place. One day, troops were completely raw and casually disrespectful of whatever training they had received. Then they found themselves on a battlefield, in situations that were terrifying, where any mistake might be fatal for them and their friends, and they became tough, experienced soldiers, knowing the elemental rules of survival. Suddenly, they could fight almost by pure instinct. Peng is right. This is a new and very different war. And if you'd like to see some action from an older war, you can click here in a little while for a mini-series we did on the Battle of Prokhorovka on our World War II channel. All that we produce, we do so thanks to the Time Ghost Army. That is our backbone. William Timothy Murray is the Time Ghost Army Member of the Week, and these are the newest officers. And you too can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time.